she was on her knees, scrubbing a floor she had once danced on, and she did not make a single sound. Autumn, 1819. The great hall of Ashworth Park smelled of beeswax and dying roses, and the 40 candles burning in the chandelier overhead cast their light downward like a judgment. The woman on her knees was not supposed to be visible. That was, in fact, the entire architecture of her existence, now to be present but not seen, to move through rooms where she had once been a guest, as though she were furniture that had learned to walk. She pressed the scrubbing cloth against the marble in slow, even strokes, and she did not look up when the boots entered her field of vision. Polished calfskin, new heels. The footwear of a man who had never once considered the floor beneath his feet. Good God! The voice belonged to Lord Reginald Ashworth, heir to nothing of particular consequence, but possessed of an opinion on everything. He was speaking to someone behind him, loudly enough that the sentence was clearly meant to reach her. Is that not Miss Beaumont? The great heiress of Hertfordshire, reduced to... He paused, and in that pause, she heard him smile. Well, to this. She kept scrubbing. The cloth moved in its arc. The marble gleamed. I confess I had heard the rumors of her fall, but I had assumed, rather charitably I think, that they were exaggerated. It seems they were not exaggerated enough. You were to have married Pemberton, were you not, Miss Beaumont? And now look at you, on your knees before a floor. How very fitting. I always suspected that was where you would end. Miss Rose Beaumont did not cry. Her hands did not shake. The cloth did not fall. She finished the section of marble she had begun. She set the cloth in its bucket with a precise, unhurried motion. She rose. She looked at Lord Reginald Ashworth with the particular expression of a woman who has already decided that this moment will not define her, and she said, very quietly, "Good afternoon, my lord," and walked from the room. It has not always been autumn. There had been a spring, a very particular spring, 3 years prior, when Rose Beaumont had been the daughter of Mr. Edmund Beaumont of Hartwell. And Hartwell had been a house of 40 rooms and a library that smelled of leather and cedar. And her father had been a man who kissed her forehead every morning before he opened his correspondence. The correspondence, it turned out, had been the trouble. Mr. Beaumont had trusted a man named Rowe, a solicitor of excellent reputation and worse character, with the management of the Beaumont estate for 11 years. Rowe had, over those 11 years, quietly redirected funds through a series of transactions so artfully arranged that by the time Edmund Beaumont's health began to fail and his daughter began to look at the ledgers herself, there was almost nothing left. The house was mortgaged, the investments were gone. The fortune, which was real and had been considerable, had been eaten from the inside like a timber post riddled with beetles, still standing, still presenting the same face to the world, until the wind of scrutiny touched it, and it simply collapsed. Her father died in the winter of 1816. He died believing his affairs were in order, because no one had the heart to tell a dying man what had been done to him. She remembered the morning. She understood it fully, not the day the solicitor came. She had not been present for that. But the morning 3 weeks later, when she walked into her father's library for the last time, and the shelves were bare. They had taken the books, every single one. Even the small volume of poetry he had read to her as a child, the one with her name written inside the cover in his handwriting. She stood in that empty room for a very long time. She did not cry. She had already decided, in some quiet part of herself that made decisions without asking permission, that she would not spend her grief on men who would never know they had caused it. She picked up her traveling case. She walked out. The estate passed into the hands of creditors with a thoroughness that was almost elegant. Rose discovered, in the 3 weeks she had to remove what was hers, that what was hers was limited to her mother's locket, her own clothing, and a letter her father had written 2 months before he died. A letter full of advice and affection, written in a hand already beginning to tremble, which she kept folded in the bodice of every dress she owned. Lord Pemberton, her intended, had been informed of the change in her circumstances by his own solicitor and had written to her with every expression of regret. The letter had been civil. It had used the phrase practical consideration twice. She read it once and burned it, and she did not weep over Pemberton. She accepted instead a position as lady's companion to Mrs. Hester Ashworth of Ashworth Park, because the salary was adequate and the alternative was to depend on the charity of cousins she had never liked. In the 2 years since, she had been 3 things to the Ashworth household: useful, invisible, and unfailingly correct in her conduct. She had also, in those 2 years, been approached by 3 separate gentlemen of title to earls and a duke, who had expressed an interest in her person wrapped carefully in the language of rescue. The most recent offer had come from the Duke of Allerford, a man of 51, 3 chins, and genuine kindness, which made refusing him considerably harder than refusing the ones who had simply been cruel. He had come to her in the garden in September, while the last of the roses were going. He held his hat in both hands. He said, "Miss Beaumont, I am aware that my age is against me and my appearance is against me, and perhaps my personality is somewhat against me as well. But I have a house in Wiltshire with a library of 4,000 volumes, and I think you are the most intelligent woman I have met in 30 years of trying, and I would spend the rest of my life making certain you wanted for nothing." She looked at him for a long moment, at his kind eyes, his held hat, the complete sincerity of him. "Your Grace," she said, "you deserve a woman who chooses you because she cannot imagine choosing otherwise. I am not yet that woman, and you deserve nothing less." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He said very quietly, "Whoever he is, he will be fortunate," and walked back toward the house. She stood among the dying roses for a long time after. She had refused all 3, not from pride, precisely, from the conviction, which she held quietly but immovably, that she would not be saved. She would save herself. She was still working out the method, but she knew what the method was not. Richard Ashworth, 5th Duke of Wexmoor, arrived at his cousin's house in the 3rd week of October, unannounced, in the rain, driving his own curricle because he preferred it to a carriage and had not yet fully explained to himself why he had come at all. He was 34 years old and had been described in society as cold, which was not quite accurate. Coldness implies the absence of feeling. What he had was something different. A great deal of feeling, very carefully contained, like a watch spring wound to its limit, the mechanism still running, the exterior perfectly still. He had a reason for this, though he had told it to no one. He had been in love once with a woman named Caroline Vane, and he had been on the point of declaring himself when his own steward, a man he had trusted since boyhood, had come to him with evidence, carefully assembled, that Caroline was already secretly married to a man in Bristol and was pursuing Wexmoor purely for the settlement he would provide. The evidence had been thorough. The documents had been convincing. He had withdrawn quietly and Caroline Vane had married a baronet the following year, and he had never quite believed, from that point forward, that the story he had been given was the complete one. But that was a matter he could not prove and had not investigated, because investigating it would require him to examine the possibility that his steward, Humphrey Vane, Caroline's own uncle, as it happened, had lied to him. And the consequences of that, if true, were too large to look at directly. He had known of Rose Beaumont before he arrived at Ashworth Park. He had known of her father, Edmund Beaumont, had been a man of good character and genuine intelligence, and his ruin had struck Wexmore, when he heard of it, as something that smelled wrong. Estates did not simply empty. He had made quiet inquiries. He had not yet received quiet answers. He saw her on the second day of his visit. She was crossing the upper corridor with a pile of mending, not her own mending, clearly, because the dress she wore was too fine for a maid and too plain for a guest, and she moved with a posture that struck him immediately. The posture of a woman who knows she is being observed and has decided it makes no difference. He did not speak to her. He watched her until she turned the corner, and then he stood in the corridor for a moment longer, entirely alone, with an expression on his face that his valet, had he been present, would have recognized as the beginning of something the Duke had been trying to prevent for several years. It was Reginald who said it first, as men like Reginald always do carelessly, in the way of someone who has never once considered that words have weight. They were standing in the library, the two cousins, on the fourth evening of Wexmore's visit. The rain had returned. The fire was low. Reginald had been pressing him, as he had been pressing him for 3 seasons now, on the subject of marriage, on the ducal obligation, the empty nursery, the estates that required an heir and a mistress with equal urgency. "There is Lady Harlow," Reginald said, "or Miss Pettigrew. Her portion is considerable, and she is considered handsome by people whose opinion of handsome I do not entirely share. But—" "No," said Wexmore. "Then tell me what you want," said Reginald, with the exasperation of a man who considers himself enormously helpful. "Tell me, and I will find her." Wexmore set down his glass. He looked at the fire for a moment, the way a man looks at something when he is actually looking at something else entirely. "Find me someone worthy of the title," he said. "Not a fortune, not a face, someone who understands what it means to carry something and not set it down." Reginald opened his mouth to respond. Neither of them heard the door to the adjoining sitting room, which connected to the library, through a passage the family used, and guests forgot close with the softest possible click. Rose Beaumont had come for a book. She still had her hand on the spine of it. She stood in the dark passage for 3 full seconds, her father's letter pressed against her heart, and she thought, what an extraordinary amount of trouble this man is going to be. Then she walked back to her room. She did not take the book. What Wexmore did not do in the days that followed was pursue her, not openly, not yet. What he did instead was speak to Mrs. Ashworth about the cold drafts in the East Wing and ensure over the following week that the fireplaces in that wing were kept well stoked and that the woman who carried the mending through the corridors was not also responsible for carrying the coal. He did this quietly. He told himself it was nothing. He had been telling himself that sort of thing for some time. He also carried a secret, a document he had recently obtained from a London solicitor who had, on his deathbed, sent for a man of conscience and found the Duke of Wexmore. The document concerned the Beaumont estate. He had not yet read it in full. He was not yet certain what it meant. But he had kept it, folded inside his traveling case, next to nothing else of particular importance. It was Lady Ashworth who delivered the worst of it, and she did it at breakfast, in front of 7 people, on a Wednesday morning in November, when the rain was steady against the windows and the fire in the breakfast room was the only warmth in the world. "I have been patient," said Lady Ashworth, in the tone of one who has never been patient in her life. "But I find I must be frank. Miss Beaumont's situation is becoming a source of comment. She dines with us sometimes, which confuses the servants. She does not dine with us sometimes, which confuses the guests. She is neither a companion in the proper sense, she does not read to me, she does not accompany me to calls, nor a servant in the proper sense, because she refuses to be treated as one. I have had letters from Lady Fortescue suggesting that to keep a woman of her former class in this ambiguous position is," she paused, and set down her teacup with the precision of a woman placing a blade, "is rather unkindness to everyone concerned." Rose sat at the end of the breakfast table, where she had been placed because Lady Ashworth found it useful to have her present when there were letters to be answered or social arrangements to be made. She sat very still. "What would you suggest, cousin?" said Wexmore. He had not looked up from his plate. His voice was entirely ordinary. "I suggest," said Lady Ashworth, with the satisfaction of one who has been waiting for this opening, "that the question of her future be settled. She has had offers. Good offers. Lord Carrick was most particular, and he is a baronet, which is more than her circumstances currently merit." "Her circumstances," said Rose Beaumont, in a voice that was perfectly level, "are not the subject I understood we were discussing at breakfast." She put down her fork. She looked at Lady Ashworth with the expression she kept for moments such as this, not anger, which was too warm to be safe, but a complete and unblinking clarity. "If you mean to recommend Lord Carrick to me again, I would save you the effort. I have already given him my answer." "Your answer," said Lady Ashworth, with a short, bright laugh that was not a laugh at all, "is a luxury, Miss Beaumont, that women in your position cannot quite afford." The room was entirely silent. 7 people looked at their plates. The rain continued against the windows. She did not flinch. She did not look around the table for allies. She did not, in the phrase she had taught herself, like a catechism, give them the satisfaction of seeing it land. But it had landed. She felt it land, in the deep private place, where she kept all the things she refused to show the grief of it, the particular cruelty of being reminded, in public, that she was no longer a person who had the right to decline. And Wexmore, who had not moved from his chair, who had not looked up from his plate, felt the whole of it, felt the room's cruelty and her endurance of it, and something in him, which had been very carefully wound for a very long time, tightened one final turn. It was not courage that sent Rose Beaumont into Humphrey Vane's study at 11:30 on a Thursday night. It was arithmetic. She had been awake since 9, turning over the facts she had, and there was one she kept returning to. Humphrey Vane, who served as both the Duke of Wexmore's steward and financial advisor to 2 other great houses in the county, had also been the personal recommendation of Solomon Rowe, the solicitor who had emptied her father's estate. That connection had not seemed significant when she first noticed it, a month ago, in a letter she was filing for Mrs. Ashworth. She told herself it was coincidence. Names recurred in certain circles. But she had kept thinking about it, the way one keeps pressing a bruised place to see if it still hurts. And what she had come to understand, lying awake at 9:30 with the rain still at the windows, was that coincidence did not feel like this. Coincidence did not feel like a door she was afraid to open. She took a candle. She waited until the house was fully still, and she opened it. The study was cold and smelled of old ink. She was not a woman who had any experience of searching a man's private papers, but she was a woman who had spent 3 years organizing correspondence, and she understood filing systems. She found what she was looking for, not in the locked drawer she had expected, that required a key she did not have, but in a leather folio marked with the year 1809, which was the year before her father had engaged Roe, and which contained a series of letters between Roe and Vane that were, in their way, a masterpiece of careful language. They never said the word fraud. They said arrangement and reallocation and the customary understanding between principals. They referred to the Beaumont estate 3 times by name. They referred to expected proceeds. They referred to a share. And at the bottom of the final letter, in Vane's own handwriting, were the words, "Should the matter come to light, the responsibility rests entirely with Roe. I have ensured my own receipts are clean." Her hands holding the papers in the candlelight did not shake. She had passed that particular test before, but her breath was unsteady, and she allowed it to be unsteady for a moment, alone in the dark, because there was no one present to see it. Then she went back to her room. She wrapped the letters in cloth. She placed them with her mother's locket and her father's letter at the bottom of her traveling case. She sat on her bed until morning. She did not sleep. She was too busy planning. That afternoon, she sent a letter. It went to a solicitor in London, whose name she had found in one of Wexmoor's own books, a man named Hartley, known for his integrity. She enclosed copies of the letters from Vane's study, transcribed in her clearest hand over 2 careful days. She signed the covering letter with her own name, in full, and asked for nothing except that the matter be reviewed. Whatever happened next, she had done what she could do. She had moved toward the problem. She had acted alone, in the dark, with a candle and 3 years of quiet fury, and she had found what no one else had thought to look for. The occasion was a musical evening, 22 guests, a competent soprano from Bath, a great deal of candlelight, and Lady Ashworth in cream silk at the head of the room, presiding over the arrangements with the authority of one who has never once doubted her right to preside. Rose was present because she was always present at these things, to manage the seating and ensure the refreshments were properly ordered. She stood near the windows, which were cold at her back and warm from the candles in front, wearing the best of her 3 remaining good dresses, dark blue, simply cut, without ornament except for her mother's locket at her throat, which she had taken from the traveling case that evening for the first time in months. She was watching the soprano perform the 3rd piece of the evening when the door to the music room opened. The room did not notice immediately, because a musical evening is not the sort of occasion where one notices a late arrival. But the soprano noticed, because the man who entered was tall and wore his evening clothes with an ease that suggested he had never once thought about them, and moved through the room in a way that made 22 people rearrange, slightly, without quite knowing why. Wexmoor walked past Lady Fortescue, who was the highest-ranking woman in the room. He walked past Lord Carrick, who had been positioning himself near Rose all evening. He walked past 7 gentlemen of various consequence and 5 ladies of various opinions, and he did not stop until he reached the windows, where Rose Beaumont stood in dark blue with her mother's locket at her throat. He stood beside her for a moment. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the soprano, who had recovered herself and resumed. He looked at the room, which had stopped pretending not to watch. And then he looked at Rose with an expression that was different from every other expression she had seen on his face, open and steady and very slightly terrified, which she would think about later, in the quiet, when she had time to turn it over. He said to the room, in a voice that was perfectly quiet and yet somehow carried to every corner of it, "Miss Beaumont has agreed to be my Duchess. I trust you will all congratulate her." He had not consulted her about this phrasing. He had, she would discover later, consulted her about nothing. He had simply arrived, 20 minutes after receiving her letter, with the document from his traveling case in his coat pocket and the decision already made. But the presumption of the announcement was so completely at odds with the warmth of his eyes when he turned to her, just to her, not to the room, that she found she could not object to the form. "I have not yet agreed to anything," she said, quietly, only for him. He almost smiled, and then he did fully and without his usual containment, a smile that changed his entire face, made him younger and less guarded, and altogether more honest than she had yet seen him, and he said, just for her, "Miss Beaumont, Rose, I know about the letters. I have known something was wrong for months. You found the proof before I did, and you moved before I could. He paused. "I have been watching you since October. I should very much like permission to stop watching from a distance." The room was waiting. The soprano had entirely abandoned the pretense of singing. Rose looked at him for a long moment, in the candlelight, with a locket warm against her throat and her father's letter in her pocket. "You may," she said, "have been somewhat premature in your announcement." "Yes," he said. "I will require a proper proposal." "Yes," he said. "And I will require," she said, "that you understand I refused 3 dukes before you. The 4th must be worth the trouble." The smile had not faded. "I have been told," he said very quietly, "that I am occasionally worth it." She held out her hand. Humphrey Vane left England in the spring of 1820, before the matter could be brought fully before the courts, which was something Rose considered adequate justice, if not complete. The money, or what could be recovered of it, was largely recovered. Solomon Rose's estate, he had died the previous year, was found to contain rather more than it should have, and the legal proceedings that followed were methodical and boring and entirely satisfying. The Caroline Vane matter, once Wexmore finally looked at it directly, resolved, as he had suspected it might. Vane had lied. He had constructed the evidence. Caroline, who was now contentedly married and living in Bath, confirmed it readily and with a candor that suggested she had been waiting to be asked for quite some time. Wexmore sat with this information for several evenings in his study, and Rose sat with him and did not offer comfort. Exactly, she offered presence, which was what he had needed, and which she understood how to give. They were married in April, at a ceremony of moderate size in the village church near Hartwell, her father's parish. She wore the locket. She carried no flowers, because she found that sort of thing impractical, and he had long since stopped trying to anticipate what she would and would not find practical. On the morning of their wedding, standing in the vestry before the service began, he said, "I told my cousin I wanted someone worthy of the title." "I know," she said. "I was in the passage. I heard every word." He looked at her. Something moved across his face, something between amazement and the particular relief of a man who has just understood how close he came to missing something irreplaceable. "You heard me," he said, "and you said nothing." "I thought," she said, straightening his cravat, which did not need straightening. "What an extraordinary amount of trouble this man is going to be." She looked up at him with the expression she kept only for private moments, the one without armor in it. I was right. You have been a very great deal of trouble. He took her hand. He held it in the quiet of the vestry, with the sound of the congregation settling on the other side of the door, and he looked at her the way he had looked at the fire in the library that night. Except now he was not looking at something else. He was looking precisely at what he meant to look at. And yet, she said quietly, entirely worth it. She had refused the floor, in the end refused to let it be where her story ended, refused to let the woman on her knees be the last word anyone wrote about her. The woman who walked down the aisle that April morning was the same woman who had scrubbed the marble in even strokes and risen without a tremor because dignity, it turned out, was not what others granted you. It was what you carried and refused to set down until the day someone finally recognized what it was worth. And on that day, you did not have to carry it alone anymore. If Rose's quiet, unbreakable dignity and the moment a powerful man finally saw it moved you or kept you at the edge of your seat through every act, hit that like button and subscribe for a brand new story every single week. Share this with someone who loves tales of women who absolutely refuse to be diminished. And tell me in the comments, if you had been in Rose's place, offered rescue by 3 different titled men before finding the one worth trusting, what would you have done? Would you have held out, or would the pressure have broken you? I read every single one.